Good evening, everyone. My name is Maria Worthen. I'm the Vice President of Federal and State Policy at iNACOL, and I would like to welcome you to our May Teacher Talk webinar, How Do Teachers Implement Blended Learning in the Classroom? Before we get started, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, if you're having any trouble with your audio, and I'll reiterate this in the chat box, you can go to the Tools menu, select the audio setting, and do your audio setup wizard. We also have a conference line to call into. If your audio doesn't work, you probably can't hear me. So I will put that information again into the chat box. Please note that registration for the iNACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium is now open. It's going to be in beautiful, sunny, warm Palm Springs, California, November 4th through 7th this year. And we're expecting a wonderful, wonderful set of sessions at that conference. Please feel free to ask questions as they come to your mind in the chat box to your left. We want to make sure that you have plenty of opportunities to engage with the presenters today. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. We have two wonderful educators who are pioneering blended learning and competency education in their classrooms in Washington, D.C. Tanesha Dixon is a social studies teacher and technology integration coach at the Wheatley Education Campus. And Shane Donovan is a physics teacher at Haynes Public Charter School. I should also mention that both of these educators are with Next Generation Learning Challenge winning schools, where really interesting, innovative new learning models are being implemented. And both Tanisha and Shane were 2013 CityBridge Education Innovation Fellows. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Tanisha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Maria, for that phenomenal introduction. I'm a little nervous, so bear with me. So tonight I really wanted to talk about really simple approaches to designing, implementing, supporting learning, and professional development in a blended classroom. It may be sort of an oversimplification of the process. Of course, there are more than 4 things that you need to do. There's a lot of hard work that goes into it. There's a lot of learning and reading, exploring, piloting, pivoting, and that all happens sort of simultaneously in my classroom. But I think, you know, the first thing you have to do is begin with an end in mind. So very briefly, I just wanted to set the context for my school. So we're a traditional public school in Washington, D.C. We have about 465 students. It's an education campus. So we have pre-kindergarten 3-year-olds all the way to 8th grade, 99% free and reduced lunch, 18% sped, which is sort of above the national average. And you know, these numbers kind of look really daunting, but you know, when we look at our proficiency rates for our standardized tests, you know, we've grown from single-digit numbers, but we don't get excited that only 1/3 of our students are proficient in math and reading. We found that our reading scores have plateaued and our math scores have sort of plateaued. We saw these huge jumps, and you know, and that's where we started. Like, what can we do to really push our students further and faster? I always tell my teachers, you know, it's not about the technology. So a lot of folks come into, you know, blended and personalized learning thinking like, what device do I need? Or give me a room full of iPads. And it's not about the tech. It's still about good teaching and thinking about that instructional problem that you're trying to solve. So I also wanted to give a little bit of background for our school. I came to our school in about year 2 or 3 of restructuring under No Child Left Behind. And when I came to the school, in my experience, I was already integrating technology, but the first year was really rough. And, the instructional problem that I felt that I was trying to address was the teacher's dilemma. We would love to think as teachers that we're teaching all of our students and they're learning all of the time, but this was the first time when I came to my school that I really had a classroom that had kids on the entire spectrum. And I did what a lot of us do as teachers, sort of teach to the middle and just sort of hope that it grabs the kids at the top, and those kids who aren't, at the top, they're not in the middle, we just sort of drag them along. And that's not fair, to kids. And as a teacher, it's almost humanly impossible to do that for all kids at all times. So I really wanted to reach all of my kids. And as a social studies teacher, I found that I had to curate a lot of my own content because there just wasn't a lot of good stuff out there. So I wanted to find a way to not only reach all of my learners, but also give them a rigorous learning experience, and also something that was really engaging as well. And so that's where I started for the design of my program. But now what do I do to implement it? The trains still need to run on time. And knowing that I wanted to reach all of my learners, no matter where they are with grade level and content standards, and moving them further and faster, sounds really good on paper, but what do you do, soup to nuts, to really put all of these things in place? And that was really hard. We, at my school, had the opportunity to pilot the Discovery Ed textbook for both social studies and science. So now the student experience was going to look markedly different. Not only would each student have a device, either an iPad or a laptop, but now we have these textbooks that are going to engage the students with grade level material. Also, I wanted to implement a station rotation. With the Education Innovation Fellowship, we had the opportunity to visit a lot of schools and see a lot of different models, and we read probably every white paper imaginable. And so I really wanted to take kernels of that and decide what would work best for my students. So I have 3 stations in my classroom. I have a station that's teacher-led. You see that over on the right. And I absolutely love that time. It's small group instruction. It's something that I craved. How do I differentiate? That was like a bad word to me, right? How do I differentiate for my students and meet them where they are? I also have a collaborative station where students are talking and trying to figure out a problem. They're actually working together. It's not about just putting 4 desks together and giving them a worksheet or saying, okay, now you guys solve this problem or glue these pieces together. They actually have to work together and help each other to solve some problem. And then the last station is where students work independently and they get to go at their own pace as well. We have 90-minute instructional blocks, and it's a little difficult to see, but there is time for a whole class wrap-up, and there's still direct instruction. I think sometimes people believe that, computers are doing all of the work and the teacher just sort of sits back, and that's not true. There's time for direct instruction and there's small group instruction. So there are a lot of moving parts, and one piece of advice that I would give to people is just start off really small. I did not, I will admit, want to give up control. I like to be in charge. I'm that type A personality. But when I moved to this instructional model, it was so much easier for me and my students because they had the opportunity to really dig deep into the material at their own pace and also pursue their own interests. And that typically doesn't happen in a regular classroom. So with effective teaching and digital content, it really allowed me to really target those specific skills that I wanted to target. And I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was definitely aligned to the standards, aligned to my instructional goals, had a content area focus, and it was also accessible. I think sometimes we run into the problem with digital content. Either it's like too easy, or kids are just playing games, or it just goes over their head. So that was really important to me as well when I was choosing digital content, because when I'm creating the material, of course it's something that my kids can do. But if I'm choosing something else, if I'm going to trust a content provider, I have to make sure that it's accessible for my kids. And then how do you support learning? Sort of like that Bigfoot analogy, like you know it's out there, you've heard stories of it. Like, how do we know that our kids are actually learning? And I didn't want learning opportunities in my class to just be an easy way to get credit. Like, we're not just, turning in worksheets or doing things for the sake of doing it. And I definitely didn't want to try to replace myself, because I don't think that there's a replacement for good teaching or playing games or memorizing facts. Like, I don't want them to become good at Trivial Pursuit. But what I did want was very rigorous, standards-based content. And I wanted to individualize instruction for my students and have them have a way so that they can demonstrate their growth and achievement and really have authentic ways to apply their knowledge. I felt that if I can do things more on the right as opposed to the left, teaching and learning will look very different in my classroom, and it would be more rich for it. But I also think that it's important for teachers to have the opportunity to develop themselves professionally. And I mean, I can even attest, and my colleague Shane will probably tell you, things that we knew to be true a year ago this time are not even true. I mean, even the definition of blended learning has sort of evolved. So when I think about professional development, definitely you want to know what are the basics of blended or personalized or competency-based learning, getting those operational definitions down. If you can, visit as many schools and as many classrooms. You also want, for your teachers, if this is something new for them, you want differentiated tech training. You will have teachers on all ends of the spectrum, and that's true for your students as well. There are students who are just ready to go further and faster, and there are some students you have to actually teach them how to turn on their devices. So just being aware of that. One of my big things is device management. Schools are making a lot of investment in hardware, and this hardware has to last. So having conversations with the teachers and the students and developing them around how are we going to take care of our devices. And this has to be a part of your culture and not one of the things that, oh, we're just trying this out to see if it works. It just has to be embedded in your school culture as well. So I hope I didn't go too fast and folks got some interesting questions to ask, and I'm going to turn it over to Shane.
Thanks, Tanisha, and thank you as well to everyone at iNACOL for putting this on, and to all of you all for spending your evening with us. My name's Shane Donovan. I teach 9th grade physics and robotics at Haynes Public Charter School in DC. For school context, Haynes is a very diverse school. We are about 70% free reduced lunch. We're about 22% special ed, also high proportion of ELL, and a true cross-section of the city of District of Columbia. And so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the instructional model that I'm using in my classroom and where it came from. So as a science teacher, I believe very strongly in inquiry-based learning, and so we call it problem-based learning. And in a perfect world, the way it works is that you have your student, and every day you teach something, and the student masters all of those independent blocks one by one, by one in perfect sequence. This is all the small prereq content that they need, right? And then at the end of some number of standards or competencies, they get to put all that small prerequisite content knowledge together to solve a big complex problem that's really fun and entertaining. In physics, for example, we do, our final project is you have to build a bungee cord for a Barbie doll that we drop from the roof of the gym, and you use that to show all of your knowledge of energy that we've studied the previous unit. We do fake crime scenes for projectile motion, car crash analyses for basic kinematics. So this is how it's supposed to work in a perfect world, right? The problem is that we know that that just isn't actually how this works. What actually happens sometimes is that you teach some standard number 1 on Monday, and then you teach standard number 2 on Tuesday, but the student wasn't there that day, so they don't actually learn that. But then on Wednesday, you're teaching standard number 3 to everyone, and the kid somehow manages to get standard 3, even though they weren't there for standard 2, which is quite impressive, actually. And then standard 4 happens, and they maybe master that, but on standard 5, their boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with them, so they're not paying attention, and they don't get that either. And then when you ask them to do a complex project, it just becomes a more confusing and complicated version of something that they don't understand. And so my problem was, how do I basically prevent my students from developing holes in their learning as they progress through content? In a traditional classroom model where you teach everyone the same thing 180 days in a row and try and remediate as best you can, that is not easy to do. So basically I reorganized how I deliver content. So now what I do now is I give students all the material they need to practice all the standards for the year, the direct instructional material and also the practice at once. They get a big course pack with all the practice assignments that they need, and they get a video library of myself explaining all the standards for the year. We have 40. This shows 6. Right? And then students can progress, kind of individual students can progress at their own pace as they master standards. And so the speed at which they master standards may vary, but because I don't let them move forward until they've mastered the previous standard, they don't end up with Swiss cheese in their learning. And it may be the case that some students take more time on certain standards than others, and that some students move quicker than others, but we still have whole class activities that we do together. And it may also be the case that at the end of the year, not all of my students have actually covered every standard in the course. And that's something I'm wrestling with now, but I'm also confident in that this student here who in the middle, who didn't get to standard 6, at least they fully mastered standards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Whereas in a traditional model, they might have half mastered everything, but not truly understand anything. So this was my big picture idea, and implementing it basically looked like this. Sorry, before implementation, the theory behind this for students, what I was hoping was that it would mirror the real world for students. In the real world, you only move on to the next thing when you've done the previous thing to standard, in some sense. If you have a job, right, if you turn in for a product, you don't just move on to the next thing. Your supervisor asks you to improve it. I also was hoping to increase students' feeling of ownership because they don't take assessments because it's Friday and that's the day we take the quiz. They take the quiz when they've done the practice to get ready for the quiz, and they have to ask me for it. And then I give it to them and they have to prove that they're ready for it. It also means that I have more teacher-student interactions at exactly the zone of a student's proximal development. So because a lot of the material they need to receive direct instruction and practice is given to them in advance, I don't spend a lot of time telling kids instructions for things, and kids that don't need me, when they only ask me questions that they really need me for. But on the flip side, my students that are very high needs, ELL, special ed, have trouble with self-regulation and organization, I can spend more of my time with them because they need more of me. It also changes my role from being a sage on the stage to a guide on the side. My personal strength as a teacher is in tutoring and differentiation in small groups, so I basically designed a model that would allow me to do a lot of that and do less whole class instruction where I'm trying to make everyone do exactly the same thing at the same time. So implementation, Here's what I did. I basically took my 40 standards and wrote assessments for all 40. I had these lying around already because I've taught the content for a few years. I also added multiple versions of the assessment, so if you fail the first time, you can try again, and also multiple modalities for most assessments. So for many standards, there's a visual version where you draw diagrams, a writing version where you write something, or a math version where you do calculations. And if you've been teaching your content for a while, you may have a lot of this material already. If not, you can find high-quality assessments out there also. And then what my students need to do my model well is they need materials that will teach them the content, direct instruction-wise, and also the things they need to do to practice in a buffet, not a la carte, but in some kind of large information dump. For practice, I gave them a big printed course pack. For direct instruction, I made videos for each standard, Khan Academy style. They're about 6 or 7 minutes long. And they are the same exact thing that I do in class when I teach those lessons in class. But they serve as something that students who are ahead can watch early. And when students are confused, I make them go back and watch the videos again before I answer questions that they have. Again, to divert my attention away from those students and towards students that really need help, like processing writing or reading. It's also crucial that you have multiple methods for assessment and that you can grade very, very fast, 1 day or less, because a kid needs to know on Tuesday, did they master the thing they assessed on Monday, and can they move forward or not? Also, you need a gatekeeper structure where you control access to certain assessments. So every 3 or 4 standards, I have a project, and I control access to those projects and those labs and those big activities that serve as summative assessments, because I don't want kids just rushing to try to do them when they're not ready. Practical tips that I have are just try and digitize as much of your content as possible if kids have a way of accessing it. Google Drive is great, Google Apps for Ed. There's a Google Drive app for your phone that's free. A lot of my students watch videos on their phones. Right? Automate grading when you can. I've moved away from multiple choice, but I do try and automate grading, give myself rubrics. Because I'm grading 50 or 60 quizzes every day, they're short, but you need to be able to do it quickly. Spend your energy on big summative projects. So if you want a model that's similar to mine, what I really care about are actually the projects, not the prerequisite standards that come before. And so I spend most of my coaching energy and direct instructional time helping kids understand those big projects. Really important for younger kids, you need a yellow jersey, Tour de France analogy. You need a pacing guide that tells kids every day what should they be working on so they can think, am I behind, am I ahead, am I on track? And also, especially for younger students, 9th graders, you need to push students to reflect on their progress all the time, both in terms of how much content they're learning, are they ahead or behind, but more important is habits, right? How do I spend my time when I have work time? When there's 6 different things being practiced by different groups of people, am I sneaking through the cracks? Is it taking me 5 minutes to find the page in my course pack? Do I bring a pencil every day? Do I ask a question when I have it? Like, what do I do when I'm stuck? And focus students' attention on those things. Because those habits I found are more predictive of success in my model than anything else, actually. Second is you need incentives to go along with those reflections, both for how much content you've mastered, but also for habits. Points or systems like that. If you want to know exactly what I do, of course I'll tell you. But you need some kind of incentive system where grades and content mastery are tracked and habits are tracked, and they're separate from each other. Questions that I still have, the big thing that students often misunderstand, go at my own pace, to mean go as slow as I want. And that's particularly salient for students that know that they can do the work but are slightly lazy, maybe from a habit standpoint. So I have students that say, like, I watched the video, can I take the quiz right now? And I say, no, you have to do the practice. And they say, I know I can take the quiz and do well. And the funny thing is, a lot of times they're right. But I still make them do the work because I'm trying to teach that habit of, like, you need to put in the work for things. I also need to make my work harder, apparently. Right? And then also students that struggle a lot with access, they like that they can go slow, but they don't realize that the year eventually ends. Particularly salient for me now. We have 11 class periods left before the school year is over, and there are some students that are a couple standards behind, and they will run out of time on June 13th, on the last instructional day of our year, and because of Carnegie units and other policy things beyond my control, they can't just spend an extra week in school putting in that extra work. They have to make it happen. Again, sources of student struggle. Accessibility of content is tough, right? I give out one course pack, but I think my model is good in that once I've given out the one course pack and they all have it, I get to spend my energy during my planning periods every day not thinking about what is our class going to do on Tuesday, but how can I differentiate the standards and the work that all my kids are working on now? What extra things can I give them? Who do I need to pull for small group tutoring, right, to help make things more accessible? So giving your boilerplate content, your basic content, out in a big chunk frees up headspace for you as a teacher to work on differentiating for the reality of your students. For ninth graders, organizational habits and persistence are huge. And so how do you teach a ninth grader that you need to work on something for more than 5 minutes, and when something's hard, what do you do? And do you not cry? Do you not yell at someone? Right? And also, if students have been taught in a system where most of their learning has been heavily directed by a teacher, then oftentimes they can be, really wanting to do well, but just they're not used to having independence. They're used to being told what to do every 5 minutes, and so they will sit and do nothing sometimes. These are unresolved questions of my own that I'm trying to wrestle with a little bit. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we're opening it up to Q&A now.
Great. Thank you, Tanisha and Shane. That was so interesting and really great to hear your candid reflections on your experiences. So we've got a bunch of questions that have come in through the chat box, and feel free to keep those coming. Thank you for your quick presentations. We've got lots of time for discussion. So our first question is from Teresa. She said, Shane, great explanation of how you guide on the side. Thanks for a full explanation. Would this work with lower elementary 1 to 3 grades? And Shane or Tanisha, feel free to weigh in.
I might say one thing about lower grades. So I actually have one section of students that are all 9th graders, but they're all performing at 3rd grade math or below. They're in physics together because their math skills mean that the regular curriculum can't quite access. So I do have one class of students that are 9th grade age but 3rd grade level in terms of math and also some other things. And I think that, so it's definitely possible. I think the guide on the side, what students need is very clear instructions about what should be happening at any given moment. And younger kids need time chunked into smaller periods. So I think station rotations tend to work a little better for younger kids because it's hard for them to do something for half an hour at a time. That would be my only, but I think there's nothing sort of in theory that says that can't be done. You just have to chunk things into much smaller pieces and interact and have a lot more systems for how kids interact with teachers and probably spend more time teaching those systems because the students are younger.
Yeah, I actually responded to Teresa, and I teach middle school 6th through 8th grade, but this year 7th and 8th grade, and being really clear about what's expected in each one of the stations has really helped, but also helping the kids to problem solve for themselves. Like Shane was mentioning, he has students who really want his attention, and part of what I try to do is help my students problem solve for themselves. And also having really clear instructions in a product. So if you're in a station for 20 to 25 minutes, what do you have to show? What work is there that says I was on task and I did, what was asked of me in that time? So I definitely think it'll work. And, we saw elementary school models where, you know, teachers weren't necessarily directly working with students. So management is also key. You have to know that your kids have the self-regulation skills, but it doesn't happen overnight. It was something that we definitely worked our way up to. I had a whole week of just like practicing how do we move from station to station, and every day I was like, okay, we're all going to pretend we're in the teacher station, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it sounds like, and, you know, having clear incentives and consequences sometimes. But you have to definitely know, like, what you're beginning with that end in mind. Like, what do you expect to get out of a station rotation if you choose that model?
So, Tanisha and Shane, were both 2013 CityBridge Fellows, which is a professional development experience for teachers in DC to implement new learning models. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what schools and models you studied, and what kinds of resources were especially helpful as you discovered more about blended learning for those teachers who may not be in DC and unable to take advantage of this wonderful fellowship.
I think it's an interesting combination of two things. So we looked at a lot of different schools, and it depends on the age. I think a lot depends on the age of the students. But I also think that, interestingly, like my model design did not come from seeing a school and going like, I want to do what they do. It actually came from some sort of, like, ideally what would learning look like in your classroom, and just get rid of every assumption you've ever made about what a teacher should be doing with their time and where they should be. And so I think it is important. You can find schools out there, Summit as a high school model, New Design in New York, Denver, STEAM, their whole charter network. But I think if you go to a school and try and copy it, then copying a model is not, I think, totally going to be a recipe for success, for complete success. There's bits and pieces you'll want to take, but I think it is really important to approach the work with like a design orientation, not a replication orientation. But those schools that I mentioned, I really liked bits and pieces of what they did, and so I took bits and pieces of those things too. Tanisha?
Yeah, and yeah, I mean the same thing. And sometimes you go to a school hoping to see something, and you see that, like, I would not want to do that. So don't count anything out. I think the more you see, the more kernels you pick up. I mean, sometimes we would walk out, you know, with like, oh, that's a smart thing to do with desks. And I mean, I don't know, like my desks are not glued down to the floor, but I never thought of certain like seating arrangements in my class, and just like moving desks around just changes the whole feel of a classroom, or how to manage a device, or things around school culture or school norms, or different incentives. So yeah, I mean, just see what's out there and read a lot and talk a lot. You can use Twitter as a, you know, a professional learning community, and yeah, just read. We did a lot of reading as well.
Also some just practical things that you can, I'm sure you can access like all of the reading we did and profiles of all the schools we looked at just by getting in touch with the CityBridge Education Innovation Fellowship directly. Also read EdSurge, because they profile schools, and sort of models and bits and pieces of ideas that I found to be really useful. There's two versions. There's the one for the instructional version geared more towards teachers, and then there's one that's geared more towards like everyone else, I guess, in education. But get on those, because those are really great. Yeah.
And I just want to call to everyone's attention, if you scroll up through the chat, there are links to blog posts that Shane and Tanisha wrote reflecting on their experiences on the Blend My Learning and Competency Works blog. So you might want to check those out too.
Yeah, those blogs are great.
Yeah. Another question we have is there software available for the exercises you mentioned, Shane? If so, can you monitor their progress more easily? And I might also add to that question, just you know, kind of in reference to the previous question, how do you choose the actual software? Because it's not about the software, but how do you determine whether a particular resource is going to meet your instructional needs?
In terms of practice and monitoring progress, I'm not using like a learning management system to do that. I was at the start of the year using Mastery Connect, which I think is great, but it's the assessments that it works best with multiple choice assessments, and I moved towards other assessments. And I think I actually am just going like old school with a poster that has kids' names and the standards, and they're checking them off, and it actually works fine. The practice exercises that I have students do are also a combination of, you know, sample problems for physics or like labs or other things. So I do give them just a big old paper course pack, but I also scan the entire thing. And our school has Google Apps for Education, so sharing things through Google Drive is very easy. Same with videos. There are learning management systems out there that I think are really are great, but often require an investment of like an entire school. Mastery Connect, though, is one I would strongly suggest if you just want kids to know their progress, like green, yellow, red style on the standards that they're working on. It's pretty cheap. It's like $59 a year for one teacher to do it. And you can just type in numbers as a free response scoring system, and it works out okay. I haven't made decisions about what technology. I haven't chosen technology for my model. I've just designed the model first and then thought, how could technology make this model work a little more efficiently? So I actually think it could work completely without technology. The only thing that technology really helps is having videos of lessons, because if you're going to be, you know, if I'm going to let you get 2 standards behind, you need to be able to see that lesson again. Or if you want to go 5 standards ahead, you need to be able to get that lesson and not have to wait for a teacher. We, as a school, are one-to-one Chromebooks, and we made that decision because we want computers that boot up really fast, because high schoolers are taking them with them all the time, and that can't get so many viruses. We actually are reconsidering our tech policy about one-to-one and whether kids take them with them or whether we keep them in carts. And that's often a school-wide decision. Tanisha, I'm sure, can speak more to that in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, so I just put in the chat that in my class were one-to-one iPads, and none of the devices go home, and in another class we're one-to-one Dell laptops, and another class we're one-to-one Asus tablets. So we kind of just have like duct tape dynasty going on at Wheatley Education Campus. I mean, we're a public school, so we have to think about procuring devices, and some districts have really strict rules about the type of devices that you can buy. Cost is always a factor. I know when you're looking at a price point, I would love Chromebooks, but unfortunately that's not something that we can do at our school because our procurement policy just doesn't allow that. But that's one consideration or one factor you have to consider when you're thinking about your blended classroom. And, you know, one of our colleagues said that if she could go back, she would just start with like 4 or 5 devices. So you don't have to be one-to-one, and there are definitely times in my classroom where we're like very low tech. It's a bonus, but it's not a necessity.
Thank you. Great answers. So we have a question from Jonah, who is a blended learning coordinator at a private school in New Jersey. who said that they're looking to implement blended learning model in their middle school beginning in the fall, but there's some concern that some of the veteran teachers are a bit worried about the change. And so he's wondering what kind of professional development do you find is best for your teachers, and how can he work with those veteran teachers with limited school time to bring them along?
Oh, pick me. Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the first things I would definitely have them do is really go through the process themselves. So it's really hard to sell folks on an idea that they can't see. And if you got like really meta about it and you have them do a station rotation where you're teaching them, they're doing something collaboratively, and some other folks are working independently, we're busy, so we really don't have time to read. And I have figured that out as the tech coach. Like, I can give teachers a 30-page white paper and it's like sitting under their coffee mug. So the teachers do not want to read. I think you have to show them. There are some really good videos out there that you can show, but what I would love for the folks out there, if you're doing this in your classroom, see if you can video it and put it on YouTube, because when I started this work, I was like, what does this look like? We read about it, but I wanted to see actual teachers and kids doing the work, and that didn't exist. So if they could visit other schools, like I said in my presentation earlier, the more the better, but really having them first start again with their instructional problem. So the instructional problem in social studies may be very different from the instructional problem in math. And like Shane said earlier, not trying to necessarily replicate what's out there, but really making it your own. Like, you really want to personalize the learning for your school context and for the teachers and their teaching style and the students, because it's about them going further, faster, and being engaged and really love the learning. So that's one way to do professional development. And I would also say, like, you also have to like differentiate the professional development. Like, I found that, some teachers are just ready to go, and I can give them the white paper and they actually want the white papers, and others, it's really slow. Like, this is your laptop and these are the wonderful things that it can do. So you have to be very patient with adult learners and know that it's very new and it's very scary to them. And I don't think they don't believe in it. It's just that they're not sure how it affects them and their teaching practice. Because like Shane said, like, we love to be the sage on the stage. We are the giver. We are the fountain of knowledge. And you really have to humble yourself and say, like, I don't have all of the answers, and I want to facilitate learning in my classroom. And so you really have to show teachers how to do that.
Yeah, I think Tanisha, because she's a coach in this regard, knows a lot about how to do this. I also think that there is a time and place for like a little bit of the black coffee approach to say, like, do you view your class as your class, or are you actually really thinking about the learning that's happening for every single individual kid in that class? Because a teacher that's like blended learning, I think, is a misnomer of a phrase. It implies like it's a technique that is used, but personalized learning, I think, is more valuable, right? If you said to a teacher, we can make the learning experience of your individual students like equitable, and give them what is personally meaningful and best for them at any given time. I don't think you're going to hear a theoretical resistance to that idea. I think what's worrisome is that if you're a teacher and you've been doing the work for a while, like, you have things that you're good at, you have things that you like doing, and you have things that you think are really great, and you may have some data to support how great it is, and maybe not. And so I think that stripping down a little bit to the bare bones and saying, look, are you motivated by your experience in the classroom, or are you motivated by your students' experience in the classroom? And are you motivated by your students holistically as a group, or are you actually thinking about them like at the level of like every single kid learning every single thing? And so, you know, Tanisha's warmer and fuzzier approach doesn't work. You can say what I said.
Great. And, we're not just talking about instructional change. This is really a cultural change throughout the system, and I think you're really underscoring that with your answer to that question. And there's some great side conversation going on. We already have Tanisha and Jonah that are going to talk offline. So it's really great to see the connections that can happen during these webinars that we facilitate. So I've also seen a great side conversation going on about grading. And for those that for whatever reason are just not able to access, that are only able to access the audio, I'm wondering if you could, Shane, you had talked about how you have a quick turnaround on your grading, and folks are wondering how do you do that, and how do you make that a priority?
Sure. Well, there's two things, I think. The first is the theoretical, the culture shift and mindset shift as a teacher to say, like, if I give them the 40 standards on like day one, and I actually gave them the first 20 on day one, and then I like gave them the rest later because I wasn't able to do it all. But if you do that, like, think about all the time that you spend as a teacher just thinking about what your class is going to do on Wednesday when it's the Sunday night. Like the Sunday night problem, right? I don't have a Sunday night problem. I don't have the same Sunday night problem. So I've reclaimed some time during my day to think about then how do I respond to the data that's coming out of my classroom. So that is first, my model has allowed me to basically claim more time for doing that work. Second, my standards are quite small curricular objectives, like for example, for physics, like explain the relationship between force, mass, and acceleration. Right? Like that's one law of motion. It's small. I can assess it with 4 or 5 free response questions that maybe take like 2 or 3 sentences each to answer, and I have rubrics for that. And so though I have quite a large number of assessments to grade each day, probably ranging between 0 if it's a day where no one was ready, up to like 60. The assessments themselves are pretty short, and so I'm able to do that. And I also sometimes I'll grade them as kids are taking them in class. So the way like a day works in class is I give a live lesson on a standard, and some kids are receiving that live, and other kids are either they're not ready yet, so they're practicing something else, or they're ahead and they've already watched the video, so they're ignoring me and practicing. And then there's open practice time where everybody's practicing what they need, and then there's like 15 minutes of assessment at the end where if you want to take a quiz, you can take a quiz. Sometimes during those 15 minutes, as kids are finishing them, I'll start grading them. Because all I need to know is, do they, like my grading scale is not 0 to 100, it's 1 to 4. 1 is you're way off, 2 is you're close, 3 is you've mastered it, and 4 is you answered the extra credit question that I put at the bottom. Because those prerequisite content standards for me are not the most important thing. The most important thing they do is every 4 standards they do a big complicated performance task, and those things take much more time to grade, and kids often have to submit them and resubmit them and multiple rounds of feedback. So my big pieces of advice are make the units of things you're assessing small, and then claim time to do that by doing a lot of planning in advance.
Yeah, so I answered this earlier. I think that, and Shane talks about this all the time, about like let teachers teach. We would love to just teach, and this year we had the opportunity to sort of differentiate my role, and all I do is teach, and I have a paraprofessional. He does all of the grading, and he and I work very closely together, so I know where kids are not understanding, but it allows me to really do what teachers need to do best, and that's plan and teach. So I'm fortunate to have a teacher's assistant who does all of my grading, and I still do a lot of it as well, but there are some short multiple choice questions that are answered, and they're automatically put in my gradebook after the kids finish. So just, quick fixes like that, like having those quizzes go directly into your gradebook really helped. If I had to then transfer them into a gradebook, it would probably be an extra step. So there is some software out there that can also make your grading life and time easier.
So the next question I'd like to ask is related to how, so you both talked a bit about how your use of time has changed since moving to a blended format. Could you also talk about how your relationship with your students has changed and the impact that you've seen on, sort of bring it down to that human level? What's the impact that you've seen in your classroom on your students having transformed your learning environment?
Well, I mean, I would definitely say that I have better relationships with my students, and people think it's just the opposite. Like if every student has a device, their heads are down and they're on their devices and we're not talking to each other. But if you think about a traditional classroom, how often do you have the opportunity to speak with every student in your class and respond to their questions and or misunderstandings? And I get that opportunity every single day. And it has totally changed my classroom because my students know that they will have the time to ask their question and to be heard, and they don't have to feel ashamed or embarrassed to ask the question, especially, at that middle school age. And if we're not talking in small groups, they can still text me the answers. I just feel like, in our vision and mission statements, we always talk about creating these digital learners and 21st century learners, and we don't allow them to use tools and technology the way that we do in real life. Like if I have a question, I will text the teacher across the hall, or I will Google an answer. So it's really given kids sort of a sense of agency I feel like they didn't have before, and I'm really proud of the relationships that I've been able to build because of the small group instructional time that I have, and also helping them to develop those self-regulation skills, because I see them in other contexts, and they don't have the opportunity to be as independent, and they crave that. They want that. So hopefully, by the time they get to Mr. Donovan, they can, work on a course packet, and they can work independently and only ask Mr. Donovan a question when they absolutely need him, and not because I just want to talk to Mr. Donovan.
Yeah, I would echo what Tanisha said precisely just about traditional model. You think you're interacting with all your students all the time, but you're just talking at them. And so you think you're talking to all of them, but you're not really. You're having one conversation, and so it's not really what you think it is. And so I found that I speak less, but when I speak to students, it's about something that they really need me for, and it allows, our academic interactions, our interactions are of a higher academic quality than they would be in a system where I'm basically giving everyone 7 minutes to answer questions 1 through 4, and bopping around and just sort of doing my best to sprinkle myself about the room. I also think that the conversations I'm able to have about habits, I've always talked about habits as a teacher, but now I can talk about habits not in the why are you talking when I'm talking, because that's distracting the class and we're losing time. I can say, hey man, I noticed that you've been looking at question 2 for 7 or 8 minutes now, and you haven't written down anything. How are you feeling about that? Are you okay? Are you stuck? How long have you been stuck for? What have you tried? Were you going to ask me a question, or were you going to sit there all day? And it's not as negative, because I can have that conversation with that kid and know that everyone else in my class can continue to work. And that I use a phrase a lot this year that the tape doesn't lie. because we're so open about the amount of progress that everyone's making in class that, you know, I don't have to, there's a very clear connection, an obvious connection between student habits and their success in class. And so I'm able to say, look, I really care about you having good habits, being respectful to your classmates, and using your time well, because look at how much we have to accomplish and look at where you are. And like, I'm able to phrase that whole conversation from a perspective that's much more caring and supportive and nurturing, and less like punitive, you're the squeaky wheel on this bus that I'm trying to drag somewhere, and you're annoying me. And so I think for high school students, that's actually been a really interesting shift for me. The tone of those conversations is just much improved, and then that academically, our conversations about academic content are just higher quality, and so lead to a stronger sense of connection between students and their teacher.
And I think it's also a different type of transparency as well. You know, teachers are so used to being the keepers of knowledge. I mean, you can think about your own school experience. It was like, when did the class end? Did it end on the last day of school or when the teacher said it ends? And now there's a different type of transparency. Like, these are the things that you need to do to be successful and learn this skill or concept. And once you do, we're moving on to the next skill or concept. And these are all the skills and concepts that you need to be successful in U.S. history or world history or physics, for example.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm seeing more questions coming in, but unfortunately we're getting to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that Shane and Tanisha, you both have a chance to put in a last word. So I'm going to give you each 1 to 2 minutes to kind of give your final thoughts and reflections. And before I do that, I just want to thank you so much for being so generous of your time and being, you know, frank with your knowledge and sharing with your peers who are wanting to do this in their own schools and classrooms, or who are doing this already in their own schools and classrooms, because I know, you know, we can all learn so much from each other. So thank you. And Shane, I'm going to let you give your final thoughts.
Thanks. I would say thanks to you all again for spending your time thinking about this. And it's going to be really messy if you try it. And it might look kind of weird, and it might feel kind of weird. But I know personally that I'm never going to go back, and I'm just going to try and think about how to refine and make this better so that like all of my kids learn everything. And I think that doing this work has refocused me on that, like, that is really the standard I need to hold myself to, and that all of our schools should hold ourselves to. And so however we make that happen, even if it looks completely different from what we have in our heads of what teaching should be, I think that's what we have to do. We owe it to ourselves, and I'm really happy to have all these partners in the work.
Great. And Tanisha, you get the last word.
You know, I think I can just say ditto to Shane. Yeah, it's really messy work, but it's very rewarding work. I kid with people all the time and say I'm on blended. Now I think I'm on like 4.5. Fail fast and often. Learn from your mistakes. There will be a lot of them, but that is the joy and beauty of this work, because we know that we need to do something different in our classrooms to reach all of our learners. And this is the future right now, and it's really cutting edge work. And I'm so happy that there are so many people that showed up and wanted to hear about it and be a part of this work. Just know that you are not alone. There are other folks in this work who would love to be your thought partners and cheerleaders, champions, and shoulders to cry on if you need it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, so this concludes our May Teacher Talk. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And thank you again, Tanisha and Shane. You were fantastic. And thanks to all of our participants for the great questions and side chats. I've already seen a number of folks networking and to follow up with each other. So again, thanks and have a great evening.
Good night.